This is Fresh Air Weekend. I'm Terry Gross. The Mueller investigation gave us insights into how Paul Manafort and his business partner Rick Gates hid their ill-gotten money with the help of shell companies and real estate, protecting it from the reach of the law until the investigation. Crooks, oligarchs, kleptocrats, and some of the super rich from around the world use this transnational shadow system of shell companies and real estate to stash their money. My guest journalist Oliver Bullough calls this transnational shadow world Moneyland. His new book is called Moneyland, the inside story of the crooks and kleptocrats who rule the world. As part of his work trying to expose this system, he runs kleptocracy tours in London, which we'll talk about later. Bullough is a regular contributor to The Guardian and is the author of 2 nonfiction books about Russian history and politics. He lived in and reported from Russia in the early 2000s. Oliver Bullough, welcome to Fresh Air. So just give us a brief description. What is Moneyland? What do you mean when you use that original coinage?
Well, thanks very much for having me. Moneyland is a country I invented. It doesn't exist in the way that any normal country does, but it's basically the place where you can put your money, you can put your reputation, you can put your children, if you are rich enough to afford its services. And it is essentially a hybrid country that exists outside of ordinary nation states, where the power of law enforcement doesn't stretch to. So it's a secret country, a private country for anyone rich enough to afford its services, and it's essentially government sort of the rich, for the rich, by the rich.
And it's a country, in quotes, that includes many, many countries around the world that specialize in various things to hide ill-gotten money.
Yes, it's a sort of portmanteau country. So you use little bits of the laws of many countries and you create something that's much more powerful, much greater than the sum of its collective parts. So that might be, you use a shell company somewhere like the British Virgin Islands, and then you add that to something like a trust in South Dakota, and then you've arranged all that via a lawyer in London, and you've holding your money in a bank in I don't know, Singapore, and essentially any one of those structures would be vulnerable to the sort of attack from law enforcement or a business rival or whatever. But when taken together, essentially it becomes almost entirely impregnable, because no one can afford to combat all of those different countries' legal systems simultaneously and unlock all the protections that the different countries give you.
And so, this is good news for the super wealthy who hide their money through these vehicles with the help of other countries, through offshores and trusts and tax havens, dummy companies. But you say it's damaging to democracy, too. How are these offshores and secret ways of keeping money damaging to democracy?
Well, I mean, to explain that, it's I suppose it's important to back up a little bit and talk about where the idea came from and where I started work. I'm a kind of Russianist, a former Soviet Unionist, if that's a word I can use, pretty ugly word, but it's essentially I came to this from having reported on sort of war and human rights abuses and degradation in the old Soviet Union. And I suppose when I first went there, I went there as a sort of naive, very early 20-something, sort of slightly thinking that I was going to be reporting on democratic transformation and the flowering of a new society and the spread of democracy all across Europe. But instead, I saw the spread of corruption and sort of increasingly authoritarian governments and all that. And it became, I suppose, Moneyland was my attempt to explain and to understand why, instead of becoming democracies, instead of becoming ordinary European countries, these states, the republics of the old Soviet Union, went off in a very different direction and instead became dominated by these anti-democratic elites, these kleptocrats, oligarchs, people who really stole a huge amount of the country's resources. And so why Moneyland and what is sort of inimical to democracy, and why the sort of offshore finance that this is based in is inimical to democracy, is because the core function of any democratic government, and this I think is something that gets lost in a lot of the debate, the core function of a democratic government is to tax its citizens for the common good of everyone. That is what a democratic government is for. Essentially, with the consent of the governed, it taxes its citizens and then it uses that money for everyone's good. If a class of society is able to opt out of that contract, if they will essentially enjoy the privileges of citizenship without any of the obligations of citizenship, then they are opting out of democracy. And if they are ruling the country, then that means that a democracy falls. That's why it's anti-democratic, because the governments of these countries are unable to tax their wealth. They're unable to essentially impose any obligations on them as citizens, and instead they get to enjoy all the benefits of citizens without any of the, what might be termed the downsides.
Well, draining a lot of the money from the country and stashing it in other parts of the world.
Yeah, I mean, incredible amounts of money is being drained, because this isn't only a problem that afflicts the former Soviet Union. This is something that, as I realised while researching this book, I started out in Ukraine and Russia and Azerbaijan and so on. I realised increasingly that from the money's point of view, it doesn't really matter what language a country speaks. It's all international. So it might be money from Nigeria, it might be money from Angola, it might be money from Malaysia or China or Indonesia, India. The money always essentially ends up in the same place, which is Moneyland, which is offshore. And the amount of money involved is a little bit difficult to say, because it's very well hidden. It's hidden by the best people in the world at hiding it. But, it's estimated by Global Financial Integrity, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C., that $1 trillion, slightly more than $1 trillion, is stolen every year from the world's poorest countries and stashed in the richest ones, countries like your country or mine. And $1 trillion is one of those numbers, $1 trillion, billion, million. I think we struggle to get our head around these big numbers that end in illion. But if you had $1 trillion in bills, and you were settled down to count them, $1 at a time, one a second until you'd finished, that would take you about 30,000 years. It's an incredible amount of money. I mean, if the first humans to arrive in North America had started counting the moment they set foot in Alaska, they'd be about halfway to $1 trillion by now. And every year that much money is being stolen. And once that amount of money is being put on the sort of balance against democracy, that money is opposed to oversight, it's opposed to equal rights for all citizens because these people want special rights, then that is a profound threat to any kind of democratic order.
So to exemplify just a small bit of Moneyland, you use a company that was registered in the name of Rick Gates, Paul Manafort's business associate. And of course, Paul Manafort was Donald Trump's campaign manager, and before that was a close associate of Viktor Yanukovych when Yanukovych was running for the president of Ukraine. I think Manafort managed his campaign and then became an aide when Yanukovych became the authoritarian ruler of the country. So you trace like a shell company that was registered in Rick Gates' name, Manafort's business associate, and Gates cooperated with the Mueller investigation. And this company was located in what you describe as an unfashionable street in London. The company was named Pompolo Limited. So what was this company?
So Pompolo Limited was one of many companies Manafort used to essentially hide his money. He used, instead of owning his money in his own name, so when he bought, an ostrich skin jacket or engaged the services of a sort of, hi-fi shop, he, instead of it looking like he was doing all the buying, because that would have made the tax authorities a bit suspicious, he used lots of little companies to do it. So it basically hid the fact that he was spending all this money. I mean, he had earned a huge amount of money in Ukraine, which he didn't pay tax on. He didn't want to pay tax on it, and was essentially then smuggling it into the US under the cover of legitimate money and then spending it on luxury goods. And Pompolo Limited was just one of these companies. It's based in a rather rundown and dull office block in Woodbury Grove in North London. And it was, I went there because it was in London, it was nearby, and I suppose you might hope that a nerve centre in the sort of Manafort empire, in this sort of very dramatic story of sort of skullduggery and high finance would be interesting, but it isn't. It's a when I went inside, I was shown inside by a man wearing an Iron Maiden T-shirt, rather sort of scruffy guy, and I went into a rather scruffy office where nothing really happened. But it was indicative in essentially of almost the mundane nature of the way that giant crimes are being enabled. There are people doing ordinary jobs, creating companies, opening bank accounts and so on. But in doing this and not doing the kind of checks that they should be doing on the origin of the money that they're handling, they're essentially enabling these vast crimes, which is what the book's about.
This office that you visited, what this office does is to create shell companies for people like Paul Manafort and Rick Gates?
It creates companies for anyone who wants them, really. I'm sure they will tell you that they will do all sorts of checks on the origin of the wealth, and perhaps they do now. Who knows? They've been rather sort of humiliated by the Manafort connection. But yeah, essentially, this is a low margin, high volume business. You sell companies. Someone gets in touch. They want a company. You sell them one. That's it. You're done. This is a very competitive market. There are lots of places all over the world. So Manafort had plenty of jurisdictions to choose from. And, he had companies in Cyprus, he had companies in many different states of the US, he had in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and here in the UK. So he was using multiple countries, multiple jurisdictions to essentially hide what he was up to. So it was very difficult for any investigator to put the pieces together. And yeah, had Robert Mueller not started investigating the potential collusion, I feel sure that Manafort would have got away with this. He structured his assets very cleverly.
So these companies are what you call shell companies, right?
Yes, exactly.
So I don't really understand how you buy a company, and then of course you can use that company to hide your money and buy things that you wouldn't want to be buying in your own name because that would trace you to ill-gotten money. So how do you buy a shell company? I don't get it.
Well, it's funny because it is something that most of us have absolutely nothing to do with. But it's incredibly easy. If you were to use a search engine, type in buy a company Nevada. Nevada's a good place to buy a company. You would see a whole list of people who will sell you a company. You drop them an email, give them a call, and they will just sell you a company. And there are sort of additional extras that come with it. They will sell you a company. You might get a company with a registered office. You might get a company with a bank account. If you're particularly resourceful, you can get a company with a registered nominee shareholder, nominee director, so no one can tell it has anything to do with you at all. But I mean, it is it's essentially an industry or business that most of us would have absolutely nothing to do with. But you can't commit financial crime without, essentially, on any kind of large scale, without shell companies. They are the building blocks for financial crime, and so they are incredibly useful for people like Paul Manafort, who are trying to commit these big acts of financial crime without being caught. And there's a whole business out there. There's all these sort of networks of agents. They're very easy to get. And if you need any, I could give you suggestions for a couple.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Hide my billions. So you mentioned Nevada is a good place to start a shell company. Why?
Nevada has very relaxed regulations on creating companies. It doesn't. A lot of places, like the UK, for example, now publish the identity of people who own companies. They publish a lot of information about this information online. You can just find it online. Nevada doesn't do that. It doesn't publish lists of its companies. It doesn't publish who owns its companies. And they're very cheap and very easy to get. Essentially, it's a revenue generator for Nevada. Nevada it uses it to complement its budget, and so it does well out of it. But I don't want to pick on Nevada particularly. Delaware does this too. Lots of other states of the union do very well out of essentially selling shell companies. In fact, it's got to the point when US companies are pretty much the best shell companies out there now, really. Compared to, it used to be places in the Caribbean, but they've slightly been cracked down on. So yeah, for the discerning international crook, I would say the US is probably the best place to get a shell company at the moment.
We're number one.
I'd say number one. Yeah, it's not all of the US. Some states are more difficult than others, but these guys know their business. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I would say the US is number one now. There've been academic studies of where it's easiest just by going and asking people to create companies, and yeah, the US is way out in front when it comes to the ease of setting up a company.
So one of the things you do in London that ties in directly to your new book is a tour. What's the name of the tour?
These are the Kleptocracy tours. They're a lot of fun. They're modelled loosely on Hollywood tours. I've never been to Hollywood, but I understand you can get on a bus and be driven around, and they'll point out, where, I don't know, Charlie Chaplin used to live, or where Scarlett Johansson buys her lattes, or whatever. And and it's a thing that tourists do, and it's a lot of fun. So we decided to do these in London, but instead of pointing out the homes of the rich and the legendary, we point out the homes of the rich and the crooked, the kleptocrats, as it were. So we put people on a bus. We normally start at a site just near the House of Commons where the Russian Deputy Prime Minister has an apartment. and we point out his apartment, and then we put everyone on the bus and we drive around mainly West London, because that's what might be called a target-rich environment for kleptocrats. And then we point out, it depends on our mood on the day, but you can talk about, houses belonging to Nigerian governors, politicians from Kazakhstan, Russia, Ukraine, Angola, Libya. I mean, we're spoilt for choice, really. But sadly we can only really do 5 or 6 properties at a time, because otherwise everyone would get exhausted. I mean, if we really wanted to keep going, we could probably do this for weeks and weeks on end without ever exhausting the variety of kleptocrat-owned property in London. London is very popular with kleptocrats.
If you wanted to expand the kleptocracy tours, you could probably expand them to the U.S. What would the best cities for the tours be?
We've talked about this. New York would obviously be a winner.
Yeah.
New York and London are kind of the capitals of Moneyland. They kind of spar with each other. In fact, to be honest, from a Moneyland perspective, New York and London are kind of the same place. They sort of blur into each other. So New York would obviously be a winner, up and sort of Central Park West, I suppose, up there. But I mean, Miami obviously huge too. Miami particularly popular with your Latin American kleptocrats. It's been amazing to me, if you watch the sort of the war of rhetoric between the government in Washington and the government in Venezuela. This sort of war of rhetoric has absolutely not disrupted Venezuelan investment in top-end Miami real estate at all. The powerful Venezuelan elite, they'd love to put their money in Miami. So that would be a fun place to do it. In fact, have a sort of historical angle. You could go back to Al Capone as well if you wanted there. Los Angeles would be good. The deputy president of Equatorial Guinea, a gentleman called Teodoro Obiang, spent a lot of money in Malibu. So that would be quite fun. And then you could go bit up the coast to San Francisco. There's been a couple of good sort of investments there, including the former Prime Minister of Ukraine, a guy called Pavlo Lazarenko, who had a really nice place up in Marin County that I didn't visit because it's behind these high fences, but I had a bit of a look at it from a surrounding hill, and that was a very nice property indeed, though he didn't get to keep it, sadly. He was put in prison and had it confiscated. But yeah, so those would be my kind of picks for the kleptocrat tour in the US. Obviously New York, then Miami second place, and then I'd say LA and San Francisco in a sort of kind of somewhere in third and fourth. I'm not sure which would come first.
Is that because these cities that you've mentioned are great places to live with, wonderful, palatial places to buy or to live? Or is it because of the laws in those places too? These are obviously lovely places to be. But, if you think about, if you're a crook and you've stolen a fortune, you're well aware of the fact that anyone in your country can steal a fortune. So they may be going to steal your fortune if someone else comes along who's bigger and more of a bully than you are. So, it's a priority to get your money out of the country where you've earned it and where you've stolen it and get it somewhere, where it's safe. So though they themselves love breaking the law and abusing their fellow citizens as much as they can for their own accounts, they don't want a country like that. So they depend on being able to get their money into a place with the rule of law. So that's why London is so popular, why New York is so popular. These are places where once you've bought property, it's very, very difficult to have that property taken away from you. How have all the places in London where you live that are really owned by often absent oligarchs and kleptocrats, how is that affecting life in London?
Well, it's really interesting, actually, because there are these sort of districts, places like Kensington, Knightsbridge, districts which were, they were always kind of high-end districts, but, ordinary British people lived in them in 20, 30 years ago. And, yeah, they were a bit posh, but they weren't that unusual. But now you can walk around these places sort of in the evening and there are no lights on. There aren't really any shops, like ordinary shops. There are lots of sort of boutiques, places where you buy, Rolexes. There's one point in Knightsbridge where you can see 3 Rolexes without even, having to squint your eyes up. They're all within about 30 yards of each other. These shops are everywhere. But in terms of an ordinary shop, the kind of place where you go and get a pint of milk, these places don't exist in those neighbourhoods. There are no pubs because, these people don't go to pubs. So it has changed the fabric of these districts, which means that not only is it too expensive now for any ordinary people to live there, but also ordinary people wouldn't want to live there, because if you went there, there's no social life, there's no nothing. There's sort of almost dead environments. And so what this is it's turned parts of our major cities, places like London and New York, it's turned them, they're now sort of essentially bank accounts. They're sort of, bank accounts in the form of bricks and mortar.
Where does Donald Trump fit into Moneyland?
I think that, there's obviously a lot spoken about Donald Trump and his ties to Russia and all of that. And, and to a certain extent, the jury is still out on a lot of that. I think that what I'm interested by this, by Donald Trump and by a whole class of property developers in the United States, of whom he is just one, is that since the financial crisis, they have become very dependent on money, on investment from foreign buyers. The sources of capital dried up domestically for a long time, and therefore they were dependent on money from China, money from Russia, money from elsewhere in order to finance the construction of these top-end, real estate blocks. And that to me is the real scandal that actually I'm really surprised that the US media has not been spending more time looking at, is that there is a whole kind of class of businessmen, of whom Donald Trump is just one, who have been accepting money from very unscrupulous sources, many very shady sources, in order to get these projects off the ground. I think if you look at the EB-5 visa program, which is what brings foreign investment into the US in exchange for green cards, most of the applicants come from China, and yet it's very, very hard to check the origin of any wealth in China. There have been a couple of court cases in which people have been shown to be kleptocrats. I expect that there will be many, many more, and even that won't come close to exposing what's been going on. I think that there's been a remarkable and very worrying lack of concern, of interest, of diligence in the origin of the wealth that's going into these investment projects. So for me, that's how President Trump fits into Moneyland, is as a businessman, as a property developer. He has benefited from investment from some murky, obscure and shady sources, and I don't think there's been nearly enough scrutiny of where that money came from.
So in terms of Donald Trump's place in Moneyland, you quote a Reuters investigation about Trump properties. Can you just tell us a couple of things that investigation found?
It was in sort of the early days of the Trump presidency, when there was a kind of journalistic feeding frenzy to find any, connection between Donald Trump and Russia. And they went and looked at, Trump developments and tried to find how many Russians owned properties in them. And they did. I mean, there were, a few dozen Russians owned properties in these developments. And, that was important, and it was good that they found it. But from my perspective, it was far more interesting that more than 700 of these units were owned obscurely. They were owned via shell companies. So we don't have any idea who owns them at all. And that's where Moneyland comes in, because it's more than not knowing that's important. These people, these 703 units which were owned obscurely, they could all have been owned by Vladimir Putin or President Xi or the Chavez family or whoever. It's that secrecy that I'm concerned about, rather than the idea that there's a couple of dozen Russians. I mean, if you put your own name on a unit and you're a Russian oligarch, then you're a bit of an idiot, really. I mean, and they're not idiots. So anyone who owns a property in Florida in their own name is not going to be a top-ranking FSB agent or whatever. So that's the story which I think has not been focused on, is the way that people, it's so easy for people to hide what they're doing with their money, what they're buying with their money, and therefore where the money comes from, because you don't know who they are.
Oliver Bullough, I want to thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful.